Welcome to the Growing Green Ventures podcast, where we listen to stories from impact entrepreneurs from across different sectors and industries, learning the real steps it takes to create a business with lasting impact. Now, today I have the pleasure of speaking with Katie Weiler, the founder of Viable Gear, a business addressing plastic waste in the aquatic food growth and fishing industry by creating product solutions based on seaweed to replace traditional petroleum-based products. Now, the ethos is by leveraging biodegradable materials, there will be a reduction in plastic waste, both micro and macro, that result from the fishing and aquatic food industries. Think fishing, aquatic plants like seaweed and shellfish. Now, according to the environmental consultancy Eunomia, approximately 27 to 67 million metric tons of plastic waste exist in the oceans, and that's growing each year by more than 12 million metric tons. Now, while the majority of plastic litter comes from plastic derived from land, right, approximately 70 to 80%, think your plastic water bottles, think your, anything that's plastic, everything that's plastic that we use. A significant percentage comes from the fishing and aquatic food industry, around 10 to 20%. Think things like fishing nets, bait bags, and other products. Now, Viable Gears aims at addressing that percentage by re-engineering the material composition and creating products that are environmentally friendly and non-toxic at the end of its life. Right. In fact, the goal is to biodegrade after a period of time in use and in the water without having a negative impact at the end. We get to speak about her journey from corporate America and consulting to how her idea came to be, working on the project simultaneously with her work in corporate America, to actually taking the leap and working on this full time. What makes Maine such an amazing place to start a business, and so much more. I had a really great time talking with Katie. So I thank you for your time again and enjoy. Katie, I appreciate you so much for taking the time to join us on the Growing Green Ventures podcast. Before we jump into this conversation, I'd love for you to give our listeners just a little bit of an overview of your background, not just professionally, but personally, and of course, educationally as well. I think that's good context too.
Thank you. So the background or where I started is absolutely not in kind of the environmental space. I started in marketing and consulting, but prior to that, I guess the real journey was growing up in Maine, on the coast of Maine in particular, which I was very lucky to grow up around boats. So I was able to be on the ocean, and I was always really interested in kind of being surrounded by that type of nature and just that connection that we all kind of have, or that I felt, to the ocean and to the environment that I grew up in. And then, of course, grew up and wanted to leave the state and went off to college. And I actually went to UVM, and I was interested in environmental science, but I felt like everyone was in environmental science. So I was like, well, everyone's doing it, so I'm not going to do it, which is funny because of where I ended up. But I then went into, I know, right? It was like the whole like rebel situation of like, oh no, everyone's an environmental science major, so no.
That's so funny.
But
they have a good program apparently. Just putting shout out Vermont. They have a good environmental program.
Yeah, exactly. Go Cats, go. So I then moved to Boston and was in the travel industry, so kind of more of the exploring your surroundings in a larger sense, and again, was lucky enough to grow up traveling, so definitely had a passion for that. But innately, when you travel, you get tied into the environment that you're in. You know, you're exploring mostly outside. You know, you're not sitting inside when you're traveling. So I always felt connected to seeing your surroundings and seeing how the impact of what's happening globally is affecting the rest of the world. And I think in particular, a trip to Africa when I was 12 was like really impactful and kind of changed me forever. With you just see all of this. We were in Arusha is where we flew into, and that was that like first visual of like, oh my gosh, this is such a different lifestyle, and how lucky am I to be living where I'm living and having all the privilege that I have. And it was like really hard to deal with at that age, because I was like, oh my God, like how did I end up in this situation? And just by chance, you know? So I've kind of always been tied into that and loved that aspect of things. But yeah, we're gonna ask
just to harp on that for a second. You go to what was the country you went to?
I was in Tanzania, and Arusha is where we went to.
Gotcha. You were in Tanzania, and you saw obviously the ways that, let's say, other people live and the standards that they live in. But I mean, did you also see the landfills next to the cities, were you being exposed to the lack of infrastructure in countries like that? Is that what you're referring to specifically?
Yeah, it was really
Yeah.
kind of the tires all
Mhm,
over, kind of
mhm.
figuring out like, wow, we don't really see our trash the way their trash is so visible.
They
Like
actually take
you
our
are
trash sometimes. That's sort
yeah,
of the problem. But
that's what
yeah,
it was like. And
yeah,
at that age,
yeah,
I definitely didn't realize. And now I'm like, wow, that
yeah.
was probably our trash that we're driving by these like
Mhm,
heaps of tires or just,
mhm.
honestly,
Yeah,
and in a way where they were making a lot of like bags and all of that out of green bags out like now that's kind
yeah,
of this like trendy thing,
sure,
but
sure.
it's like that was innate to them. They were like, what else are we going to do with this?
Mhm.
Let's use it to make a bag. Let's use
Yeah.
it to, it's plastic waste. How can we reuse it?
Mhm,
And for
mhm.
us, it was just put it in the garbage and we don't see it. And
Forget about
that's
it, yeah.
right. That wasn't the luxury then and definitely
Mhm,
isn't now. So
mhm,
yeah, I definitely attribute that trip to, wow, what a life-changing trip. And at an age that was really susceptible to seeing that
mhm,
stuff too, I think it would have impacted me no matter when I had gone, but it was still pretty impactful then. And so kind of a tangent of then working in the travel industry, which I loved, but it was a kooky company and I was ready to get out of Boston and I
sure,
was like, all right,
yeah.
let's see what's next. And I decided to work for a management consulting company that's a family company. And that was also because I could be remote. And because I was remote, I could live in Wyoming and I could ski. And so that was
I love
a
that,
big
I love
piece
that.
of like, hey, they said as long as you're near an airport, go for it. So I got to again enjoy the outdoors in a
And this
very
is
different
before
part of the
COVID,
country.
and this is before
This was
COVID
before
too.
COVID.
Wow,
Yeah, I
you
was
lucked
remote for
out.
six and a
You
half years. And I think people don't even understand. They're like, oh, 3 years of remote. I'm ready to be back in the office, or
yeah,
3 years of remote and I could do this forever. I don't know where people are going to be at when they hit 6.5 years, but I was like, I need more interaction with
totally,
people. And
totally.
again, it was also during COVID. So I was like, all right, I think I'm ready for something new.
Yeah,
But what happened in Wyoming is kind of the impetus for viable gear.
yeah,
So I have always been into documentaries and all of that.
mhm,
That's been like a genre I've always
yeah,
liked. And I watched A Plastic Ocean,
uh-huh,
and I very much attribute the pledge at the end of A Plastic Ocean to kind of where I am today,
mhm,
because they ask you to take this 30-day pledge to be single-use plastic free. I was like, okay, sure, I'll give it a try, see what happens, or how hard is it, how much plastic is in my life. I knew I definitely for sure at the grocery store had a lot of plastic in my life. So
it's
it
unavoidable in
kind
many
of
ways, yeah.
became this, yeah, it became this journey of like, how far can I take it? I was bringing my own cloth bags to the
Mhm,
salad bar at the grocery store there. And I
mhm,
think I could only do that because it was a small enough place that they were willing to work with me and kind of be like,
yeah,
all right, this is the crazy lady who keeps coming in and asking us to like wrap cheese and cloth. And I was
so,
totally down with that. But
yeah,
it turned into this like people in town kind of being like, oh, you're the girl that's like trying to be plastic free. How's that
interesting,
going? And
yeah,
then I had friends being like, just do an Instagram, just like, can we all see what are you doing? Like, what products are you using? And so started an Instagram, ended up
interesting,
getting on a few boards to do some board work because people knew, oh, you have some experience in this. And so really that was like 2017. And since then, the global plastics crisis was kind of this side passion project until I
mhm,
moved back to Maine and decided to start Viable Gear.
interesting. Wow,
Yeah.
that's an amazing arch, and there's so much to dissect there, which we will get into in just a moment. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, I have a few questions. Have you always wanted to be a founder or an entrepreneur? Has that always been something on your mind? Sort of tangentially, what was your dream job as a kid? What did Katie want to do when she was a little
Oh
girl?
my gosh, that's a great question. I think I wanted to like work on an elephant rescue. Like,
Ah,
I don't know. I was
yeah.
so like, I'm gonna work with animals. Like that was
Okay.
100% what it was, but I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So I was kind of that person who also was like, I want to go to the Olympics, but like I didn't necessarily excel in any sport. I was just like, that sounds cool too. Like I was that very aspirational kid without a
Sure.
lot of like
Good.
focus to like be
Good.
like,
Good. Good.
okay, cool,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. So I also did watch my father was a founder, is a
Oh, okay.
founder. And
Gotcha.
so I think I have this like, that's cool. You're kind of your own boss, but wow,
Mhm.
that's a lot of responsibility. People who you're
Interesting.
responsible for their salaries, you're
Yeah.
responsible for their family income, you know. So I watched it and was like, I think I could do that, but I don't know if I want to. And honestly,
Interesting.
it wasn't ever something that I was like, I have to start my own company. I don't know if I ever felt that, but I always felt like, why aren't we doing this? Or we could be doing that better,
Mhm.
or whatever it was. It kind of felt like I've always innately been decent at sales. So to me, I was like, if I start something, which who knows what it is, I'm sure I could sell it pretty well. So it started from this kind of like, what am I going to do? What am I passionate
Sure.
about? And life, thank goodness, has kind of just taken me this way. And there was, of course, those middle years in the middle where I was like, I thought I wanted to do management consulting because I
Mm,
loved working with clients. I loved seeing the change. I loved the like progress and all of that. But I realized, that's not really my passion. And
sure.
there's there's a not in a bad way, but there's a million people who are great at it who want to do that and love it. So they can go do that
They
and I'll
want
go
that
do
career
something
path.
else.
Yeah, for sure. For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
It,
So yeah,
is it fair to say then? I think founder is a term that could put you in a box. But at the same time, you can be entrepreneurial in different life pursuits without being a traditional founder. I mean, this is where we start to, connotation versus denotation, right, of these
right.
terms. But it sounds like you have always had an entrepreneurial knack. And of course, I think I'm always interested in the relationship between a child and where they end up professionally and their parents sort of work. Sometimes I notice a pattern where, and I could be completely wrong, this is a personal hypothesis, but you either fall really close to the tree or really far. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, you look at you now, I mean, you are an entrepreneur, you are a founder, and you come from a family where that was, I guess, so visible in your life.
Yeah.
Your parents were so.
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna say, and now I'm sitting here thinking, oh, if my parents listen to this, I will be remiss to say my mother was also a founder. She started her own gallery and
Very
ran
cool.
that for years and years, and so I
Totally.
have to plug that as well,
So
you
I
know.
absolutely, shout out parents, man. Of course.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out parents for sure. Yeah.
Has doing good always been a big motivator for you in your professional work? The idea of the organization that you're a part of or the problem that you're addressing has to align with you on let's say, a values level, independent to your entrepreneurial pursuits, but also from when you were in management consulting or when you were working
Right.
in marketing and the like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge piece. I think I've always kind of had this. Sometimes I say it's like too strong of this like moral compass of like
Uh,
there's so much shit happening. Yeah, yeah. And that was a huge this like pull for me with some
mm,
of our clients in management consulting.
mhm.
You're always helping the organization grow and the executive team work together and do better things, and kind of you see leaders grow. But to me, it was like, is this company doing good? Like, do we want to help this company grow? Do we want to help? Like, this is maybe not a company that I personally align with
Sure.
seeing being successful and growing. So
Yeah.
that was a big kind of piece for the work that I was doing in that space.
Mhm.
And for the most part, we were working with really great companies who were doing good things, but there was kind of always the odd occasional one that you're like, interesting, but
Yeah.
here we are. So they were always doing decent things within an industry. I think mining is what comes to mind for me. But then you see, okay, well, we've like cleaned the water to like 96% and it's one of the cleanest mines. And it's like, okay, well, there's a positive, but so,
Yeah.
but I think this like moral compass has always
Yeah.
been something in my life that I've had to deal with, and whether it's good or bad, but it's like sometimes, you don't want this moral compass that's just like driving you so hard. And I feel like I've always really had that and had this conscientiousness of like, oh, is this the right thing? Are we doing good? How can we help? Who can we help? I think I got that from both of my parents as well. As my dad always said, my mom made money to to be philanthropic with it. And I really do appreciate that I grew up in a household that was very much talking about what we need to do to be philanthropic, to give back. If you're making money, give that money back to your community and people who need it. So, yeah, it's always been a piece of me, and especially in the pursuit of a career or what I'm doing with work.
Amazing, amazing. So, on that note of doing good in your work, you're in a management consulting company. You're helping a bunch of clients out. You're living in Wyoming at this time, but your role is as a marketer, correct? You're explain the
It
before we jump
was.
into the ideation of Viable Gear and how you made that transition. Your role within that management consulting company was in marketing. Can you elaborate further on that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I started in a support consulting role, so like your traditional associate at a
Hmm.
consulting company,
Hmm.
and then had come from marketing at the travel company. So I kept seeing things like, hey, why aren't we doing this? Should we be
Sure.
doing this? We
Mhm.
always talk about sales and filling the pipeline. Marketing goes hand in hand. So they
Yeah.
kind of like put me into that role of like, okay, why don't you also do that on top
Mhm.
of the client work? And it was totally fine because the load wasn't crazy at first, but then eventually it became a full-time job doing marketing, and ended up with an amazing boss there who transitioned before I left. So I left as the director of marketing, which was
Cool.
great and exciting, but again, not my
Yeah.
passion to push SEO stuff forward. And I think that's one of those things that people love, analytics and
Sure.
data, and they should for sure do that. And for me, it was like, I want to spend less time staring at my computer, not more.
Sure.
So at that time, which great work again, like it was fun to learn different sides of marketing. I always like to remind people or talk to people who are like, "Oh, I'm in marketing." I'm like, "What do you do in marketing?" Because it's such a broad category. You could be
Mm,
doing
mm.
anything from like photo, Instagram, like influencer, people still say they're in
Yeah.
marketing, to literally like down and dirty data
Yeah.
analytics, you're like keyword SEO, like you're in there deep every day, and that's all under the marketing realm. So I feel like I've actually covered a pretty big span of it because I started as a creative account manager, which was working with copy, photo. We were doing
Yeah.
still direct mail, which was like
Wow.
paper. A lot of people
Wow.
don't know what direct mail is. I probably am
Yeah,
like
that's not
dating
talked about
myself
a
by
lot.
even saying direct mail, but there's still a very old population of people who like to travel and they want to look at that
That's so funny.
tangible
Yeah, for
catalog or
sure.
postcard. Yeah. I think they've transitioned a little more to email, but it was very fun to like
Yeah,
do all sides of it because I left
totally.
at that company doing a lot of email campaigns with
Hmm.
like the loyalty clubs.
Hmm.
That's fun niche as well of the marketing world. So
Yeah,
yeah.
gotcha. So, Katie, you've taken up this director position as head of marketing at the management consulting company, and then this idea of addressing the plastic pollution, addressing the plastic crisis starts to sort of still is eating at your head, it sounds like. Can you tell us about how the idea formed before you made the actual leap into doing this full time?
Yeah, so it was probably one of those ideas that was germinating over a few years, and it
Mm,
took kind of, I would say, a little bit of the pandemic time for me to really say, okay, this is what I want to do. And the impetus was kind of, I was applying to other jobs, just seeing what's out there, kind of in the blue economy. Where can I work? I had some interviews, I had some applications that I never heard back from, and finally was like, why don't I just start my own thing? But then needed to figure out, okay, what was that going to be? And part of this was, so COVID happened obviously in March of 2020. And
mhm.
in the summer, I went up to my parents in Camden, which is an hour and a half north of where I live in Portland. And we were out on an island that we grew up going to. It's like 5 miles off
Mhm.
the coast and it's
Yeah,
uninhabited. It's just like a small island. We
yeah.
always grew up going there. And it was covered in plastic, and a lot of it was ghost gear. And I
Mm,
didn't really like, we would always see the occasional buoy, the occasional, like zip
mhm.
tie from, or rubber bands or whatever it was. It was always a little bit of something, but we picked up, I think, 121 pieces of plastic.
Yeah.
And we like swam back to the boat, got more bags to put
Yeah.
everything in. So that was my, okay, what can I do with ghost gear? What can I do with ocean plastic? So it
Yeah.
became really clear to me at that time, I really want to help tackle ocean plastics. So I was an ambassador to Five Gyres, which is out there based in California. They used to be the Five Gyres Institute, I believe. They just go by Five Gyres now. They do a lot of plastic education and fund a lot of plastic research. Like they just did a study around, I think, like PHAs and PHBs and the breakdown in the ocean. So they do some really awesome work, and I knew what they were doing, so I kind of was following them, like what's happening in this space.
Hmm. Hmm.
And at the same time, I got really into seaweed, and seaweed is a huge emerging space
Totally.
in Maine at the time, and kind of everywhere now. But 2.5 years ago, there wasn't really anyone on the market talking about seaweed for plastics, but there was a book called Eat Like a Fish, and Bren Smith was talking about the polysaccharide structure of kelp being similar to corn. And at that time, I was like, well, corn is
Mm.
PLA. So if people are making plastic out of corn, why can't we make plastic out of seaweed? And I'm sure people were like under the radar working on it. But when you Googled seaweed for
Yeah.
plastic, there was like
It's so niche.
one
Very, very niche.
journal. Yeah, exactly. From
Hmm.
like the University of Tel Aviv. This guy had made a plastic out of seaweed, and I tried to get in touch with him. They were like, this was just research, like lab stuff. We're not doing this commercially. So this is really the impetus of Viable Gear around the time of like, okay, how can we change out plastic for an alternative? Why not use seaweed? And then the other piece was the right whale Endangered Species Act stuff was all coming through Maine and really impacting the fishing community,
Hmm.
especially with the rope tensile strength was going down. So I figured, hey, if we're making ropes weaker, let's make it out of a different material and not out of a petroleum-based plastic.
That piece I just want to harp on. So
Mm-hmm.
the rope pencil strength went down. Can you elaborate on what you mean by this?
Yeah, so it's called lobster warp, and it's the rope that goes from the buoy to the trap.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
there's usually three traps to one rope and one buoy on the top. And that rope is what they're saying whales can get caught in, which they can. But in Maine, there haven't been any incidences of right whale death entanglement from that lobster warp because
Hmm.
they're all marked. So when a right whale is found with ghost gear or lobster trap tangled around it, usually it's on its tail. They haven't found that any of it is from main gear.
So what
So
I'm hearing is that there's this change in the law that reduces the tensile strength requirements for main fishing gear that you're talking about, and as a result of that, you are also at the same time simultaneously knowing about this new seaweed-based plastic that could fit now the new requirements that aren't as
yeah,
stringent or strong as before. Is this
yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of
niche that you're able to
correlation where
find?
I
Yeah.
was. And of
Hmm.
course, you start with this like broad, oh my gosh, we're going
Sure.
to change lobster
Yeah.
work for the better and all of this
Yeah.
stuff. And it took a long time for me to figure out how I was
Yeah.
going to go about it anyway. And then it was like, okay, it's really hard to make like just like this really bigger, stronger rope. So let's start small. And
Mm.
what viable gear we decided to do was first was that I wanted to source the material. I thought somebody's got to be doing this. Like
Mhm.
this can't possibly be the first time me as like not an engineer, not a material scientist, nothing in that world was like,
Yeah.
cool, this has to be happening. And,
Yeah.
little did I know there was places like AlgaeNet, which is now Keel Labs. They were really the only people I could find who were working on something that had been on the market. And they had this
Mm.
sneaker. And so I reached out to them and was like, can I buy your material and make a rope out of it? And they were like,
Yeah.
we are back in the lab doing R&D. And all of a sudden, everyone was so nice. All of the founders that I talked to
Yeah.
and scientists, and everyone was like, yeah, that was just like a test, or we wrote a paper on it, but we're not commercializing, or there was basically no one who was like, yeah, this is what the material is and you can buy it from us or license it and make it yourself. And that's what
Hmm.
I had figured going into it. And that just wasn't the case. So then it turned into, okay, well, I can't just make a product out of this material because it doesn't exist. So why not start working on it
Hmm.
myself? And
Hmm.
in order to do that, as a non-engineer, non-material scientist, I had to go out and find that person.
Yeah.
So that was the big kind of leap of like, what the hell am I doing? This is
Yeah.
crazy, but also let's see what I can do. And at
Mhm.
the same time, I was still working at Brimstone, so I was like, great.
The
I'm just
management
gonna
consulting
kind of,
company.
yes, the management consulting
Yeah.
company. So I was like, cool, I'll just kind of do this on the side, do this at night. Just, it was a lot of sending emails to people, talking to people. And at first, of course, I would like to say I vetted the idea with a lot of fishermen. And it started first kind of with this idea of a buoy. That was like the initial viable gear. What can we do? And it's funny now because I was like, aren't people doing things with mushrooms? Like, can't we make a
Yeah.
mushroom buoy? And now I'm definitely affiliated with a company called Myco Buoys, which is using mycelium to make
Yeah.
buoys out of
Yeah.
mycelium, and they're wonderful. And but that was like I started talking to mostly lobstermen, and me thinking growing up here, oh, you probably lose a ton of buoys. People probably run over them with their boats, all of that. They were
Yeah.
like out of 800 buoys, or they have 800 traps. So out of like 300 to 500 buoys, we're losing like 10 a year, max 30. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that's not a huge market. And at the same time, there was like one polystyrene lobster buoy maker in the US or Canada, North America, either way, and they had shut down. So that was an opportunity to me, which was like, ooh, well, none of this is made in North America, at least, but
Hmm.
that was
Okay.
kind of the first fleeting idea of viable
Gotcha.
gear, which then
Yeah.
turned into the ropes and the plastic and how do we replace either nylon or polypropylene with
Hmm.
a seaweed based material. And I think it was first I talked to my boss at Brimstone. Her husband is a astrophysicist. So he is like really knowledgeable about all of the material stuff going on and
Yeah.
knew what he was talking about. And that was wonderful. So he pointed me in the direction of an engineer that he knew down here in Portland who was
Mhm.
affiliated with like a pay for service lab. So I went to them immediately and was like, hey, what can you do? And they were kind of like, we don't really work with like bio materials at all. We are like plastics people and composites people. So, but they were like, we're interested. So
Yeah.
what can we do? So that was kind of the piece of starting to work there. They were also affiliated with the university. And I'd have to say I was leery of working with the university because I just knew the issues with some IP stuff or whatever. So I went into it, I'd say that's a piece that I would tell all even founders, entrepreneurs to just immediately just off the bat, protect your idea and it can just start in a really nice way. Like you don't have to be aggressive about it or anything, but it's like,
Yeah.
hey, can you sign a confidentiality
Th-
contract? Can you
th-
sign an NDA? Any of that stuff.
That's a great question, and I love to just sort of, so again, just to sort of place this in a timeline. Like you're sitting there and you're really coming up with these ideas. You're starting to speak to individuals, some thought leaders, subject matter experts, and the like, who know a lot about how to make these things happen, or you think that they know about how to make these things happen, but you haven't formulated anything in and of itself. You have these ideas. Did you have a written business plan? Did you have a LLC incorporated yet? Both of those questions, actually. Let's
Yeah.
start with that.
Yeah. So at the time that I found the engineers, I
Uh-huh.
had an LLC, I believe. I might have gotten it after I started working with them. That's a great question. But it was either way, that was around a similar time.
Yeah.
Business plan, I had like a partial business plan because I essentially was like, I don't want to put a ton of work into this thing that's like questionable. Like, like, can we even do this? If all of these people who are way more knowledgeable than I am are like, no, like, we can't do this, or oh, that's interesting, let's try. Those to me were very like, that's how I kind of am, is I'm like, hey, can we do this? Can somebody tell me? Like, I know I have enough self-awareness to be like, I can read all the papers I want and someone can do this at lab scale, and that doesn't mean you can do it commercially. So
Sure.
that was the big thing where I was like, before I put any massive effort into building out a business plan, let's see where we even get or who I can talk to. And then it started with, okay, I got into an accelerator that was like a seafood sprint with Gulf of Maine Research Institute and Sea Ahead out of Boston. And that was really great because that opened up a massive network for
Sure.
me. And I
Sure.
would say like tapping into accelerators and other people's networks was the game changer, because I then met people who are mentors still today. And then the engineer that I work with now is someone who I met through one of those programs. And he
Gotcha.
is far and away, he has like 30 plus years in the seaweed engineering space.
Oh, wow.
And without meeting him, I honestly might have given up at this point, because the pace that it was moving at a different lab was not going to work. I mean,
Yeah,
you can't move that slowly and hope that something works, because that's just not how you can't
totally.
sustain that. So yeah,
Yeah.
I would say yay to other people's networks and saying, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Does anybody else know? Can we do
Sure,
this?
sure.
Like, what's going on here?
This is something that I think a lot of people have questions about, right? If you have an idea, a lot of people, and I'll speak for myself, I'm similar to you. I come from a business background in terms of the actual skill sets that I bring to the table, my
Yeah,
education and whatnot. So when you think about all these ideas, it would be cool to make some piece of product made out of seaweed, or make an app, or make something that I, as a marketer, I, as a salesman, do not know how to do. I have no idea how to make something out of seaweed. I do not know how to process something in a lab. I do not know how to code X, Y, and Z. So how did you go about, and I could read stuff, but it's not the same thing,
right.
What advice would you give other entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs who have an idea, they can articulate a market opportunity, but don't have the technical skills to actually create said product or service, i.e., a
Yeah,
material or a product, or something even like an
right.
application or something on
Yeah,
digital.
yeah. That is a great question. I assume people have done it in all sorts of ways, but I'm trying to think
Sure.
of my like number. I think it's really like, just because you don't have the skill sets doesn't mean you can't get it done and figure it out. To
Mhm.
me, I think there's probably people who can do the thing, and then that it just stays in their head and they're like, yeah, I can make this, but it's like
Mhm.
no one's thought about commercializing it. So it really takes that combo of people to get something going, and the hardest piece is finding those people. And it's not easy, I'll tell you. 2.5 years in, it's still not easy, because I'm not the engineer yet. I sit here and try and figure out, how do I extrude this material in a way that makes sense, that's not creating inconsistencies, it's not,
Yeah.
I'm like building off the bat some like janky stuff that I'm like, okay, what is this even? But I was
Yeah.
working with this amazing engineer who taught me what to do. And then from there, I've really like picked it up and been able to say, okay, I'll make this batch of formula. This is what's happening with it. And then we get together, and because he is a consultant, he has his own company. I can't hire him full time. I wish I could, but there I know that we're going to get to a stage where we're going to say, okay, now it's time to hire this person, and we're going to have to
Gotcha.
go find someone. But
Cool.
right now, he is just the brains behind the operation. And so finding that person is the hardest hurdle, but like keep looking and keep asking people. And I think having that, I guess, like the humility enough to be like, I can't do this, but this is what I'm looking for. Does anybody know? And I think in accelerators, people either come to it with that mindset of like, let's open up a network because I need this person, or I need to figure out how to do this, and I'm just going to go and asking questions. Or there's a separate mindset where people come in and they're like, I know my business, I know exactly what I need, I think I can do this myself, or I know exactly the person that I need. And that can be a barrier, I think, is if you think you might not. So just like have a little bit more of that open mind, or be able to say, I don't know, what do you know? I don't know. Can you help? It's
Yeah.
that, it's really that piece of like, humility in my mind, just or self-awareness to say like, yeah, I'm smart and I'm capable and I'm doing great, but like I don't know what the hell I'm doing over here, and that's totally
Yeah.
okay.
Was that a was there a large was that a hurdle for you? Was that a big problem in terms of, obviously, again, like, you're well read on the subject. You really can articulate that the market opportunity and the need for these things, and conceptually what the business is about. But at the end of the day, like, founders, they come to the table with a set, or anyone really that's creating an organization comes to the table with a set of skill sets and their strengths. And again, like, you are coming with a business background, with a marketing background. Has it been hard to um take up the roles required to be an entrepreneur and a founder? You're in charge of the books, you're in charge of the financing, you're in charge of accounting, you're in charge of production, supply chain, X, Y, and Z, and obviously you have the help of this engineer and others as well now. But tell
Yep.
me about how you approached the other pieces of the pie that were required to start a business that you didn't have expertise in, outside of the engineering, which you just
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, everything seemed super attainable to me except for like the engineering and the making of the material. I was like,
Yeah.
what the fuck? How do I do this?
Mhm.
So that I think I'm sure there's a million other things that I didn't think about or wasn't equipped to, but I was so hyper focused on like, I can literally do everything else except for this. Like that was where my mind was.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah.
because I knew once I got to the piece where I was like, had enough accounting needs that I could hire out, and like, or I can still do it, like, or whatever it is. And but now I'd say, now that I have an hire someone who's full time, and then I'm still working with about 2 to 3 people who are consultants, and that's so easy, with like, okay, you guys are the experts, send me an invoice. We have to figure out funding. I mean, I'd say that's something we haven't talked about, which is funding is the huge piece for me that I was like, how do I do this without just going and asking for help, or not help, but like, to me, I didn't want to immediately go to friends and family because, again, I was like, I don't know, it wasn't like I was making a lunchbox or like a pudding and was like, this is how you do it differently, and I
Yeah.
can do it, like, it wasn't something tangible that I could bring to an investor and say like, this is what we're doing, want to invest?
Yeah.
People love products, people love to touch and feel things, and I couldn't give anyone something to touch and feel at the beginning. And to me, I was like, I don't want to ask for someone's money if I can't even touch and feel something. So
Mhm.
I was very much like, I'm going non-dilutive all the way until I need to or want to have investors. And I've been lucky enough to go that route, but that was a huge piece. That was a big hurdle. And that's why I stayed with Brimstone, with the management consulting company, for so long, because, or not, I mean, it wasn't a crazy amount of time. It wasn't like another 6 years while I'm working on this, but you still need to be comfortable enough to say, okay, I can really do this, and we are doing it. So now I'll go off on my own, but it takes a comfortability to do that.
Yeah. Well, to that point, just to sort of, one of the questions I have for you is really, how did you get that initial funding, and where did those kind of funds come from? Like, how did you pay that engineer for the first time? How did you pay your first invoice under this Viable Gear LLC?
Yeah.
How much of, did you drain your entire personal savings, or did you, like, honestly,
Yeah.
how did you get that? How do you get the
Yeah.
money? And then of course, I mean, to your point earlier, just to be very clear about this, how much of an overlap of time were you both working on Viable Gear and then also working at this management consulting firm beforehand?
Yeah.
Because you're now full time with Viable
Yeah.
Gear, and
I've
so
been full time for probably a year and a few months.
okay.
So I Oh gosh, the first few things that I paid for, I just paid for out of pocket. That was the first kind of like pay for service piece of the engineering work. I just paid for out of pocket.
Mhm.
And I'd been working, and, I had a career for almost 10 years at this point. So I was like, okay, I can do that. But then you, of course, need to come up with a plan of like, I'm not going to drain my entire savings. And I do want to make sure Viable Gear is a separate entity from Katie Weiler's bank account. And if when you're founding a company or starting an idea, or even like working on, something novel, that you're like going to put some of your monetary like capacity
Resources.
into
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
you're gonna spend some money there. So that's what I did initially. And then the second big piece was from a grant that the internal the engineer who I was working with, who was part of this university system, part of the University of Maine system, said, oh, there's this internal grant. So basically, it would have to stay within the university. It could go from kind of like the UMaine system into him as a professor, and it entailed like students had to be working on it. But at this time, I was like, great, anything towards progress to me is great. It turns out, I'm still glad that we did that, and they did a lot of really good work, but it's
Mhm.
really slow to work with university grants and student time. I mean, they're students, they're going to class, they're doing all these other things. So it's
Yeah,
no hate, no shade to
totally.
the students in the process. It was just too slow for me. And I'm not
Yeah.
a patient person. That's one of my weaknesses. But especially with this, I was like, this is my livelihood. This isn't a student project. Like, this is
Yeah.
now where
Serious stuff.
I'm
Like,
deciding to focus my time,
yeah.
and I need the respect back to say either we can do this in this timeline or we can't. And that was like the expectations that I was struggling with.
Mhm.
But that was kind of the first big chunk of money towards work that
Mhm.
was a grant. And then there's a place in Maine called the Maine Technology Institute. Shout out to them because they have been so beyond helpful to Viable Gear. And they have different phases of match grants, basically. So the second big chunk of money was it looks like $50,000, but it's $25,000 of a grant basically, and then I match it or whoever matches it. So that internal UMaine grant was a match to this MTI funding, which was
Oh, cool.
wonderful. So to me, that was like the biggest key about being able to
Yeah.
use this initial grant, because I couldn't touch that money. It was only to the work
Yeah.
that was going on at the university, but
Yeah.
I could still use it to say, okay, can I kind of pay myself a little bit, but mostly pay now a consultant who I had been talking to, and he was advising the students. So I was paying his time, and then I
Uh-huh.
needed to pay for materials. And, it was all of that that was kind of coming together at once. And I went out to another company, Material Connection, to say, hey, you know what? Am I actually reinventing the wheel? Because that was my biggest piece that I get frustrated with in our very like can be fun, can be not fun capitalistic society of people reinventing the wheel constantly. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's for the good and is beneficial, but something like this that's really new and really innovative, I really was pretty strongly like, I don't want to reinvent the wheel on this. If someone has already made a seaweed plastic replacement that can go in the marine ecosystem and last,
Mhm.
why would I spend time trying to figure that out when it's been done already?
Sure.
So I'm glad I did that, but it showed me like this isn't out there. Like there isn't a seaweed material that goes in the marine environment. So that to me was a big impetus of like, okay, well, we'll keep plugging away.
Is this the time when you felt you knew you really wanted to commit fully to this idea? Can you elaborate on that emotional journey from when you were ideating this, you're talking to people, the wheel is turning, let's say, but there's that moment when you really take that leap of faith. Is that the time, or was it before? Can you
Yeah.
elaborate on that?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the time that I like really knew, okay, I'm going to take this leap of faith. But I know it was July 2021. No, July 2022 that I was like, I'm leaving, I'm doing this on my own. So, what was the impetus of that? It's a great question. Um, I think it was probably that MTI grant that I was like, great, I'm making $6,000. It's going from like a corporate amazing salary with benefits, and I was like, I can do this. I just got $6,000. Like it was kind of delusional, honestly,
Sure.
and it still feels that way sometimes. But it really was the like, okay, people are seeing the potential in this other than me,
Mhm.
and people had been, but
Mhm.
of course, to me, I'm my own worst critic. I always have been. So I was like, again, I don't have anything in hand, or like I would have something in hand that was really brittle or really like very much like, great, this is 100% seaweed input, but it's not going in the water, or it's not withstanding, like as soon as you hand something to people that you say, this is going to be a twine, people are like, like it's just human
Yeah.
nature to like want to like really pull at something. And I wasn't going to put something like that into, because also from like that marketing standpoint, I was like,
Yeah.
the first thing that I put in someone's hands, I want it to be as good as we can make it at that time. So I'm not going to put something in someone's hands that they're like, have you touched that Viable Gear stuff? Like, I can't imagine that's going to be stronger,
Yeah.
So that was really my like big thing. And I'm sitting here looking at this like really strong, sturdy, like really awesome piece of
Yeah.
material that I would put in anybody's hands.
Cool.
And that is like an
Cool.
exciting thing. And I think we got to a point where I was working with Colin, our consultant, and I was working with the university still in a capacity, and there was enough people in play that I was like, wow, I think this is going someplace. And it was a time thing. Like you mentioned, how much was I spending at doing the management consulting work, the marketing work, and doing Viable Gear, and it became like brimstone all day and then Viable Gear all night. And you can only do that for so long, working from like 7 to 11 on the thing that you're actually really passionate about.
Yeah.
And you wake up and you still want to work at that, but you have a full-time job. So I didn't want to be half-assing my full-time job. So that was the piece where I decided, let's give it a go. I can always get another job if I need to.
Sure. No, completely. And at that point, I think it's important to acknowledge for all of us that we have a limited amount of energy, intellectual and emotional energy that we can allocate to anything, right? That's why it's a bit of a red flag when people sort of spread themselves way too thin with a million different projects at the same time. It's like, you can't do everything at the same time. We're all humans. So to that point, though, about this sort of transition, the question I always like to ask the entrepreneurs on the show is really about how they dealt with insurance, for example. Now, you go from a full-time job where I'm assuming, healthcare insurance is part of the benefits, to quitting effectively, and then you're on your own.
Yeah.
Did you go uninsured for a long time? Did you have to pay like a lot of money out of your pocket to get this, just to have bare minimum every month?
Yeah. And I think this is like one of those things that people don't talk about enough. So I'm so happy to be very honest about it, which is I certainly didn't want to be uninsured because I have some health issues, and I was like, I can't be, like, I know that I have certain things that I need to do. So I decided to do the Cobra through our company. Would not recommend it. It was just like one of those things that I was like, this sounds so wonderful, that they'll continue your health insurance, but it wasn't super wonderful. So, but that was the piece, is that it's very expensive. So first that was like, okay, I have 6 months of this, like prohibitively expensive it seemed, but then I got a quote and I was like, okay, maybe not. So I just like ran with that for a few months before I could go out on the open market. And then Maine has a really great and very easy process of being on the market. And I am so thankful. And I should have said that too off the bat. And I said that about Maine Technology Institute, but I'm so happy that I founded this company in Maine and started Viable Gear in Maine, because there's so many resources, not only for startups, but for people who, like me, I'm like, wait, what the hell do I do without insurance? Like, I've always had a corporate job. I've like, what now? Like, and so it was people who were like, now you go to coverme.com and you type in what you made and you get your insurance and all of that. So yeah, it was really helpful to be here and to have those easy resources. And so open market insurance, also not super cheap, but way cheaper than Cobra. So
nice.
Yeah. But I'm lucky enough that I had savings enough to do that. And that's still a piece that is a struggle, financially. And people don't always talk about the personal stuff, but I'm happy to. I'm an open book. And my husband, now partner at the time, was also, thank you, was also starting his own company. So having two startups in the house,
the deep end, both of you guys.
So stressful. I mean, he was 5 years in when I decided to start Viable Gear. So that was almost even more stupid, that I'm like, I've been watching this for 5 years.
Yeah.
not make a profit or not whatever, and they have their
So funny.
patent and they're in a
Yeah.
great space right now. But yeah, it was like, oh shit, well, now we both don't have insurance, so we both don't, like
Yeah.
definitely put a little bit of pressure and like could create a pressure cooker
Yeah.
situation. So if you're looking for just like marital bliss, maybe don't have two startups in a household. But also if you
Yeah.
make it through that, then
You'll make it. Yeah. You can
you're
do
make it through
anything.
anything. Yeah, that's what I hope
Yeah.
anyway.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
To that point, if I may ask, I think the question I don't think it's talked enough about on the same note is the impact on your personal life, the financial uncertainty of starting a company, and the
Hmm.
financial requirements that are involved with having a startup, and that falling on your shoulders, independent of getting grants and other external funds and whatnot. But how did that impact your personal life? Having to now be a little bit more on a tight string budget and a lot of your money going to things that you didn't have to before.
Yeah.
Can you
Super
tell me about
stressful.
that? Yeah.
I mean, for me anyway, who's someone who like likes to go out to eat and have a nice
Right.
drink and like all of
Yeah.
that, which is very much like I've always been someone who that was a priority for me. I was like, I want to be with friends and
Yeah.
family and go
Yeah.
eat good food and have drinks. And that was like, and travel. And guess
Sure.
what? All of that takes is money coming in the door, not just
Sure.
going out the door. So
Exactly.
now
Exactly.
for me, and I've always been kind of that like psycho about like making sure I had money coming in. And like I've worked under the table since I was like 14, like it was, so
Yeah.
I was
For
that
sure.
person that was like,
Yeah.
that was my biggest anxiety. It was like, now I'm not going to have an income. And so it was a decision for me. Do I go? I worked at my friend's restaurant. So the first summer, that like end of summer, early fall, that I did leave Brimstone full time, I worked at my friend's restaurant because I was like,
Hmm.
I just simply like need to
Yeah.
know that something's coming in.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the grant that I had was tiny for my own gain. And yeah, it's just really stressful to
Yeah.
all of a sudden say, I've always been decent at budgeting, but not when you realize, okay, nothing's coming in. So
Yeah.
it was a big, like, we really need to budget. We really need to like stop going out to eat. It was very much putting like
Hmm.
parameters around how many times we can go out to eat a week, how many times I'm like going to do
Yeah.
certain things. And it was it also was a big piece, I should say, that I could continue to do that. If I had to be on a complete lockdown and like couldn't do that anymore, I think I would have been really, really shitty to be around. Like I think it would have been a total asshole. And I didn't want to be that way. I wanted to
Hmm.
make sure I was still happy enough. And we have gotten to a point now where like there was a bigger grant that's now a bigger salary for me that has come in the door. But
Nice.
prior to that, I was like, my family, our family unit was getting on this little cusp of like, oh shit. Cause at the same time, my husband's also looking for a job because they got their patent. They're looking to white label, like they did what
Yeah.
they needed to do with their
Yeah.
company. So now he is on the hunt again. So there's
Mm.
a time now where it was like really thin of like, I can't keep doing viable gear if I don't get this big grant. And thank
Yeah.
goodness I got the grant and we're good
Good.
now. But like
Good.
it can be really stressful and really shitty. And
Yeah.
I understand
Yeah.
how, and I'm sure I was not like a bucket of fun all the time. I'm sure I had really stressful moments, but
Yeah.
I also chose to do this and I'm very thankful that I was able to choose to do this and
Yeah.
could do this. So I
Yeah.
think I hopefully keep that piece with me a lot. But yeah, I'm glad I'm able to do this, but if it got to a point where I couldn't, I would be really upset. And that's something that's on my mind all the time, which is
Yeah.
like, and now
Yeah.
that I have an employee too, full time, that's even more like I'll sacrifice my salary to pay her salary if that's what needs to
Of course.
happen because I want to keep her on.
Of course.
And I think there's a lot of people like that. And that's not something that founders talk about either. And I grew up again, in a sense where we heard those conversations, which is like, founder is always paid last, or should
Yeah.
be. If
Yeah.
it's
For
if
sure.
it's not happening, then that's like, a
An
leadership
issue with the
issue
priorities. Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
But
For
yeah,
sure.
yeah. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
choosing to start a company and hire people, then you need to make sure those people have their livelihoods. So that
Absolutely.
was the piece that I still am like, whew. let's see how this goes.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
Katie, how has being an entrepreneur and being at the forefront of scientific innovation as you are, but really at the end of the day, just being an entrepreneur and having to sacrifice a lot for this company and that being your whole world effectively, how has it impacted your day-to-day relationships? Or more importantly, how has that impacted you as a person, how you show up in the world and interact with everyone else on a personal level?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something I've been thinking a lot about recently. I think more specifically is when I'm head down, like grinding on trying to figure out material stuff or figure
Yeah,
out how we extrude this. I'm like, get really frustrated. I'm like, what the fuck? I'm not the engineer, but like, okay, I have
yeah,
to be. You know, like you have this like constant conversation in your head of like, but you need to be right now, and that's okay. And then you need to also be able to like leave that feeling behind and still go interact. And I thought about it. I was lucky enough to also get married last month, and I took
wow,
the
really,
time.
congratulations. Jeez,
Thank you.
okay,
Thank you.
seriously.
But
Seriously.
I took that week, you know, and I hadn't taken a
Yeah,
week off, not thinking about Bible gear and not opening my emails
yeah,
in like 2.5 years, you know, because I was just like, we're so in it. Or, you know, I
sure,
would talk to anybody when it worked for them or whatever. And I think we're at a point now where I can be a little bit more particular around my schedule and all of that, and I'm very happy about that. And I still have the flexibility to go do what I want, but not the financial flexibility anymore. So that's something I miss, and I'm hoping, you know, that's the big sacrifice, right? Is like I might be able to tweak my schedule to have a week off, but I
hmm,
can't go like fly to Europe and have a week off anymore, you know, like hopefully soon or at some point we'll be able to do that again. But
yeah,
I used to be able to do that. I was lucky enough to have a salary where my friends would be like, do you want to go to Spain in 2 months? And I'd be like, yeah, let's go. And
yeah,
now that's not happening. And I
yeah,
miss that. And I miss the interactions of just being able to just like be a little bit more financially free. And again, that's a
sure,
huge privilege, though, that I don't take for granted that I had. And when you start to be in a very different situation, you can see it could be a lot worse than where I'm at right now. You know, I still was financially smart before and made decisions where we can still keep living our lives and all of that. So it's just a little different now. And I think I show up in a little bit more of a different way, but I think I'm still like innately the same me, and I just have a little bit more financial stress on top of
gotcha.
that. Yeah.
This is the result of also making a business that has a really positive impact on the world. So it's a sacrifice worth having, and the world thanks you for that. Even in the short term, it's a little bit tricky at times. Katie,
Thank
I'd
you.
love to switch gears to a little bit more science and environment focused questions, because we've heard about this journey that you've been on from your previous role to Viable Gear and this sort of starting this up. But I'd love to understand from more of a scientific perspective, right? What is seaweed is, and you mentioned mycelium earlier and mushrooms and whatnot. I mean, those two things are on a wave right now, rightfully
Definitely.
so. So many innovations are coming out of it, and so many plastic alternatives are coming as a result of seaweed in particular. And it's amazing to see companies like Sway and Nopla and all these others that are doing some really cool stuff with seaweed as a whole. But what for those that don't understand, what is the difference between a product like yours, a material like yours, and a material like Sway's, for example? Like, what is the actual difference
Yeah.
between yours and the others that, from what you said earlier, nobody had made a seaweed based product that has the properties that yours has. So, can you elaborate on that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a shout out to them because, like I said before, people under the radar were working on these things
Yeah.
and didn't have a presence when you Googled seaweed based plastics or whatever. And now so many come up, and they're all awesome companies with awesome founders and a lot of women founders, which is also
Yeah.
really awesome.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah, and they're mostly working on single use plastic replacements that are
Hmm.
all for land based use. And we're
Hmm.
working on a plastic that is made to go right into the ocean. So I don't know if I even mentioned kind of like the intro of like what Bible Gear is and kind of like our mission or what we're working on, but I can do that now if that makes sense.
Go.
Okay, so Bible Gear is working on a plastic that is made to go right into the ocean.
Mhm.
So it mitigates like immediately when nylons and polypros and all of the plastics, basically any plastic from a water bottle, a plastic bag, a piece of fishing gear, as soon as it enters the water because of the marine environment and UV light, it immediately starts breaking down, shedding, and that is what creates microplastics and nanoplastics and also macroplastics. So macroplastics are anything over 5 millimeters, which is still pretty small. So that is a lot of plastic out there.
Mhm.
And again, like a roughly 70% of that macroplastic is from the fishing industry. So that's where we wanted to start, which is there's tons of plastic that's made for its life to just be bought and put directly into the ocean. So, and usually the goal was that it would be retrieved. Like, I'll throw that out there. But there's a lot that happens where
Yeah,
it's not
it
retrieved.
doesn't.
So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's kind of the
Yeah.
main difference is like land-based, single use, so like shorter lifespan and dry
Mm,
lifespan. With I guess with the exception of like a lollyware straw, that's of course meant to go into your drink, so that
yeah.
lasts for a certain amount of time in
Yeah.
a wet environment. But ours is definitely like long-term, wet, salty, really harsh environment.
Gotcha. Katie, one thing I'm really interested in about again, and whenever I'm speaking to entrepreneurs who are creating products and with innovative materials, but really just entrepreneurs who are creating circular businesses or just products that have a lot more environmental focus, it seems to be a disconnect between what consumers know, what businesses are prioritizing, and of course the infrastructure that we exist within that would enable the scaling of those technologies. So I'm curious to know from your point, specifically when it comes to um, plastics in the ocean, in the aquaculture space, let's say, what do particularly consumers and policymakers need to know to create that system where products like yours can scale? And then we can think about them from two different perspectives. The consumer,
Yeah.
what does your consumer need to know about your product for them to get the environmental benefits? And what would you like to see policymakers do differently to enable products like, and not just products like yours, like, oh, Viable Beer can have more sales,
Yeah,
but
just
just like
yeah.
environmental companies to really scale these solutions
Yeah.
in
So
general.
I'll start on kind of the front piece, which Viable Gear and me in particular have spent a lot of time thinking about
Hmm.
because especially in this industry, the fishing industry has done a lot to change over the years, especially the lobster industry, I'd
Hmm.
say. But it's a tougher community of people to get to change. I think it's it's so hard because that's such a stereotype, but some people are like, give me a new product, I want to try it, that's so exciting. And some people are like, what's wrong with the old product? I would
Mm,
say the biggest piece for us is going to be cost, but mostly I think we're actually really close to cost, which is really exciting. But
mhm,
I think the biggest piece is really like longevity. So right now, if we make a bait bag out of our material, it might like, or what I think we're hoping that people would understand is that if you can only fish with it for one season versus two, because it's different how people fish with bait bags. Because again, this is like one of those things that is not uniform across all fishermen. But some people try and fish their bait bags for 2 seasons. Some people just use it for one. But I think right now, if we were like, hey, how's one season, we would get pushback from people. But the environmental impact of that is like, because that's cost too. Okay, we have to buy more for the second
mhm,
season or whatever it is.
mhm,
But I think there's a piece of longevity. I should just like start on that as a whole around more environmentally friendly products and materials is that there used to be cotton and hemp rope used in the lobster industry. But as soon as nylon rope came out, it didn't fray as easily on the rocky shoreline. It lasted longer. It's tougher. It feels better. All of these things. But there's environmental implications to that. And so that's the really big thing, which is longevity as a whole. something that is natural is simply not going to last as long as something that is petroleum based.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really hard for people to, I think maybe they can hear that and be like, makes sense. It's coming
Mm-hmm.
from our earth. It's probably meant to degrade and turn back into something else. But when you turn something that's seaweed into something that looks like plastic, I think people then expect it to be plastic, and that's just really not the case. It's going to degrade. It's not
Yeah.
going to be as strong, but in many cases it doesn't need to be as strong. Like we use plastic for so many things, and I'll use bait bags as an example too, which is like it's a nylon bait bag is like a 1,200 pound tensile strength. Like you're not hanging 1,200 pounds off of a bait bag. Like you're just simply not,
Yeah. Yeah.
even when it's like sinking through the water and you're pulling it back up, that's not
Yeah.
that much pressure.
Yeah.
So, things just have been over engineered. And right now we just need people to change their mindset to like,
What is actually required?
what's going to degrade or what's going to be
Mhm.
better for the environment, and perhaps natural materials are the route to
Gotcha.
go in my perspective.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
To that point, the end of life component to what you offer is biodegradability in the water. So, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
but what is the end of life
Yeah.
solution for your products?
Yeah, so if it's out of the water compostability, and then in the water a span of time, it will basically like do what plastic does, but it's not toxic. So it will biodegrade into like it'll like fragment. That's what
Hmm.
we're seeing right
Hmm.
now is it
Hmm.
breaks down and it turns into these little fragments.
Hmm.
But a fish could easily eat our material. I mean, we could eat our material right now. We're working on changing the formula a little bit, but it's currently food grade. So like
Wow,
that's the
that's huge.
level where we're at, where
Yeah,
if you're eating microplastics, obviously there's a ton of
which we
health
are, which
implications.
we are by the record,
We are,
which we
yeah,
all
yeah.
are.
We
Yeah,
are absolutely, let me be
every
clear,
one of you
we
that's
are,
listening is eating a lot of plastic that you don't
if
know
you're
about.
breathing, you're
Yeah.
ingesting plastic. That's what our dryers, our clothes dryers are nicely emitting. But that, yeah, so we are intaking plastic, whether we're eating it or breathing it or anything.
Yeah.
But if we can say, okay, we have this material that fragments and does the same thing, but when an oyster consumes it and then we consume the oyster, it's not doing anything to either organism. It's
Mm.
not having a health implication for the oyster and
Yeah.
it's not having a health implication for us.
Hmm.
So that is really a big positive that we're
Amazing.
looking at.
Gotcha. No, that's super good to know because again, like when we think about the environment, the positive environmental impact that a product like yours has, to be clear, so it has a potential for compostability at the end of its life, and of course the lack of plastic pollutions and toxicity at the end of life. But what about the beginning of life? What about its production and creation? Is it a lower carbon intensive process to manufacture this, or what can you speak about the manufacturing of your products as well, as
Yeah,
opposed to the
yeah,
traditional petroleum-based materials?
right. So we're currently obviously not at commercial scale. So
Totally, of
we'll
course.
see about the energy levels that it takes to produce our material then. But it's no different than kind of like your classic energy use. We're not using any toxic chemicals. We're kind of pretty low on the uh, energy suck type of manufacturing. So our materials are all naturally sourced,
Hmm.
but currently there isn't a biorefinery in the US for seaweed. So that is one thing that we have a carbon footprint behind. We are getting our seaweed material from a few places right now: Ireland, Scotland, or Japan, depending on the formulation.
Hmm.
So that is a goal of ours. And there is a company, Everything Seaweed, which is working on starting a biorefinery in Maine, which is extra exciting for us that it's
Yeah.
in Maine in
Hmm.
particular. But
Hmm.
even if there was one, you know, in New York, that would still be better. I mean, you
Run
start
across
to
the
get
world.
to a
Yeah.
piece. Yeah, well, you start to get to a piece for us in Maine where like Ireland's not all that far away. So, California is
Touche.
further
Touche.
than
Yeah. That's
Ireland is
fair.
for
That's
us.
fair.
But,
Yeah.
we have to weigh what the carbon footprint of that is. But
Yeah.
right now, we don't have another option. And that's a piece I think also that companies who are working on this type of material and more natural materials, you have to start someplace. And for me, I was like, well, I don't want to get it from Japan. Like, we want it here. And it's like, well, that's not an option. So do
Mhm.
you want to like do this and use the correct thing, or do
Mhm.
you want to wait until that's here? Because that could potentially be 3 years. So it's
Mhm.
baby steps towards the good is kind of how I look at it, where it's like, I mean, that's still exponentially better, in my
Yeah.
opinion, than pumping oil offshore and using that to make something. So
Completely.
I'm
Completely.
very happy with the
Completely.
choice to
Completely.
ship something from Japan if that's what I need
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
But right now, yeah, I think I'd love to give you like quantifiable numbers about like the energy difference, but
Mhm.
because we're pumping so much oil to plastic manufacturing plants to make virgin plastic, it's not only this huge scale production that's super dirty because you're just like, first of all, creating like dirty water and like the pollution that it's taking. And like you look at these facilities and they just look really scary, and they are scary for people who live near them. And we really need
Yeah.
to like be aware of like the Ohio River Valley and how many plastic plants are there. But they've started pumping, I might get the name wrong right now, but it's the byproduct of oil and fuel that basically makes the plastic, and they're like pumping these like miles so they have like the oil refinery where the oil comes up, and then they're like pumping this other thing to a plastic manufacturing plant, and the energy that it takes to like pump these through pipes to the plastic manufacturing plant must be a that's a ton of energy just right there. And what is
Mhm.
the energy coming from? There's it's just all really dirty and
Yeah.
stressful to start thinking about. But I'd say us taking some seaweed and turning it into our material is
Yeah.
exponentially better. And we can't wait we're like starting to work on what our carbon footprint's going to be, especially if we scale and where we need a
Mhm.
source from. But that's going to be
Mhm.
a really fun piece of viable gear to say, like, hey, this is the difference of
Yeah.
what our material is versus a traditional petroleum based plastic. So,
Yeah. Typically, these innovations come at a premium, and a lot of the times, you mentioned pricing beforehand, but I love to dive into this really quickly. A lot of the times, these innovations come at a higher price point, obviously due to the natural R&D costs associated with that. Um, how how do you operate in a market that's potentially very price sensitive, and what is the appetite for ecological products um, from your consumer base? Yes.
yeah, so I would say very price sensitive.
Mhm.
And the aquaculturists, people who are ocean farmers, have a higher appetite for wanting to use better products on their farms.
Mhm.
And there are some fishermen who also feel that way, but in general, it's less than kind of the ocean farmer aquaculturists who are really like, I want your material yesterday, versus some of the fishermen who feel like, prove it,
Mhm.
like, I don't necessarily need this, but if it's the same price, I'll use it. And if it
Mhm.
works the same, I'll use it. And so it's two very different kind of like groups. But what our first product is going to be kelp seeding twine. So that's the aquaculture space. And people are really excited about like growing kelp on a seaweed based product. So that's really circular and that's really fun to talk about. And so far, people are like, I would pay a little more,
Okay.
because there isn't something out there that's like a seaweed harvesting twine, or I mean, a seaweed growing twine for hatcheries, because they're just using nylon twine that's right now used for like tufting on
Yeah.
boat cushions. So
Yeah.
it's something that they've taken and they've said, okay, this is a new innovative aquaculture sector. And what can we use that's already out there? And I think that's also what's exciting about ours is we're saying we're making this product for you. So we're
Mhm.
talking to a lot of people who are running hatcheries saying, what do you want this to look like, feel like? How much texture do you need on it?
Mhm.
How long is it going to be in the hatcheries? How do you want to take it and spool it out onto the long lines? So it's really fun to make a product that doesn't even exist right now, and
Yeah.
to have it be a circular product is exciting. But then there is the cost piece. So
Mhm.
people in this space are willing to probably pay a little more for it, where I would say for bait bags for the lobster and crab industry, people really want it to be the same price, cost competitive. And I think we can get relatively close, but that first run, you just innately know it's not going to be. It's going to be more expensive. So then the question is, do we get government stipends? How do we work with the government to say, do you want to incentivize the fishermen in your state to switch over to this bait bag? Do you want to give them some kind of stipend? We're definitely in the midst of this like really big push right now to figure out how we could work with local and state governments to get more people to incentivize people to switch over to our gear when it's on the market. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a big piece of what we're trying to figure out because we don't want people to have to spend more on it. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
the plastics industry did to the first biodegradable plastics, right? Is they were like, oh wow, you can like make a shampoo bottle of that and then put it in your compost and it breaks down. Well, we're just gonna like plummet the price of virgin plastics now.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem, right? Is like we're a country that's run on oil lobbyists, so it's really hard to be cost competitive to petroleum-based products. But we'll work on it.
Touche on that part. Yeah, touche on that part. Okay, two last questions for you. A few last questions. What does success look like for you in the next 5 and 10 years, both professionally and personally?
Ooh, good question. I think professionally, I would love to say that we have at least three different products on the market and are perhaps looking at an exit strategy. I think that's probably a little ambitious for the next 5 years. So I'll say maybe that's in 10 years.
Sure.
But, just part of who I am as a person too is that I also really want to have a family, and
Mm,
that does come at a price for women in our society, and that just
yeah.
is what it is. So I think there's that personal and professional piece are for women not something that can be separated. And
Mhm.
being in that age range where it's like, okay, we just got married, we're thinking about that. So I'd say personally, it's like looking like, hey, I can still be a part of the like Viable Gear's future, still running Viable Gear, still hopefully having products on the market and seeing where we're at with Viable Gear and what that looks like. Are we pivoting, not pivoting, but diversifying to say, okay, we have some marine based products and tubular meshes. Now, do we then branch out to agriculture? And the farming industry is huge, obviously, in our country, and there's a ton of plastic and mesh used in
Mhm.
ag. And I think that's a pretty big space for us to innately and naturally go
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
there are meshes used. So I think
Yeah.
getting into diversifying industries that Viable Gear is working in would be a huge piece of what success looks like to me. And then if we're hopefully able to have a family and I can do that as well, then that's also a big win. So I think that there's a lot of intertwining pieces within
Sure.
that success of the next 5 to 10 years.
Sure. I love that. I love that. Any last words for the audience that you'd like to leave them with on any of the
Oh,
comments that we've talked about before or we didn't touch on?
yeah, I mean, I think just support new and innovative things. And I think it's a really important piece right now to look around at what's happening on our planet. It's
Mhm.
can be scary, it can be anxiety inducing, but it can also be a glimmer of hope and a glimmer of kind of this like why we need to change. I kind of look at everything happening right now and it's a case for change across humanity, not just like
Mhm.
how we're all living and interacting, but how we are all consuming. There's so
Mhm.
much. I mean, what is it, today's like Cyber Monday or something. It's like there's
Yeah, it is
always
literally.
more to yeah, like there's always more to consume. and
Yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with consuming necessarily, but make sure you're more conscious about what you're consuming or
Yeah.
reduce or so I
Yeah.
think there's just, and it doesn't have to be crazy. Like I think people think and see these like low waste lifestyles and they're just like, I could never do that, what a shift. And it's like baby steps, like one change
Yeah.
a day or less than that, just like wake up and do one tiny thing differently, and that's a
Mhm.
step towards a change. So
Totally.
people don't,
Totally.
it doesn't have to be this like radical thing, but
Yeah.
people have such capacity to be really fucking awesome and awesome to each other, really nice,
Yeah.
like nice citizens. And I don't know. I
Yeah.
think we just need to take a look around and do some work on that. But
No, we'll touche
yeah,
on that, and I just want to acknowledge. I want to acknowledge you for what you just said, because I think that you're the perfect embodiment of that. I'm lucky to know Katie for a few years now. We worked together on a project in the past, and not only have you always been just a delight to work with, but this, what you're doing is so amazing for the world, and
thank you.
keep on doing it. Keep on doing you. You're living your life authentically, and obviously that's coming across in this company that you've created, and it's just amazing to see. So again, I thank you so much for being on the show. It means a lot, and I hope that our listeners,
Thank you.
I know that our listeners have gotten something good out of this. All obviously links to your business and to your company will be in the description below. But again, Katie, I just want to thank you again for this, because you have an amazing story, and Viable Gear is going to go big places. So excited to have you on
Awesome.
board.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.